Chair, we're now live.
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
wanted to try and improve my lighting so that that people can see me. I'm looking like a dark shadow at the moment. So, good morning. Welcome to Transport for the North Scrutiny Committee on Tuesday, the 5th of September. This broadcast is a remote meeting. However, it will be webcast, and so that people can watch it, and it can be played back later. So everybody on the call, just remember that what you're doing, even when you're quiet, will be observed. So I'd like to say welcome to the committee. We have some new members today. I can see a number of different new faces. I apologise for not going through all the new names today, but I am very grateful for your presence, and the committee will be so much the better for some, want of a better phrase, some new blood. So just to kick the meeting off, declarations of interest, please, Gary. Oh, sorry, apologies, I guess, Gary.
Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor Thurley and Councillor Burton.
And Councillor Cowslick, I guess.
Yes, as well.
Thank you very much, Gary. Has anybody on the call got apologies for anybody else that they believe should be attending? I can still see somebody in the lobby, Gary.
Yep, I'm just trying to find and see where they're in the minute, but yeah.
Thank you. Okay, moving on now to declarations of interest. Does anybody have any declarations of interest today? Okay, moving on to the next item, the minutes of the previous meeting. There's one matter arising from the minutes, which we are not going to do today, which was the election of the minority vice chair. But other than that, could I have somebody to nominate that the minutes are a true reflection of the last meeting, please?
Yeah, happy to nominate.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you very much. So today's main item, and it's unusual for us to only have one item, but it's a very important item, is the Strategic Transport Plan update, which is going to be presented by Lucy Jacques, and she's suitably supported and sponsored by Katie Day. The key thing that we have to do with this particular piece of information is note what has been come in the consultation, provide particular feedback on the themes that have come out, and this is to help with future with the future development of this when it will come back to us in our next meeting in November. So the critical issue is for you to feed in. I think it's a particularly timely thing. It certainly is for me in North Yorkshire, and a couple of our other authorities have effectively become unitary authorities in recent months, because we're probably visiting our local transport plan, and this is going to be quite helpful, I believe, in the formulation of that, and also possibly an iterative process where some of our individual ideas are perhaps reflected back to the strategic plan for the North. Anyway, over to Katie and Lucy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to leave Lucy to walk you through the detail this morning to share the headline results that we've had from the consultation. We are still processing all of the responses, so this is the first headline view that we are able to give, and our intention is to sort of take your initial feedback and thoughts here this morning ahead of going to the main TFN board at the back end of this month to seek their views and steers on some amendments. And just noting your feedback previously, that around wanting to just give some observations on the consultation process itself. I'm just going to ask Lucy, as she goes into the presentation, just to pause when we get to that numbers slide of the level of responses we've had, and perhaps, Chair, at that point we might invite some comments. And then I think Lucy's then going to sort of work through the rest of the deck with suitable breaks to give members chance to give views as we go along, given the length of the slide. So if that's all okay, I think then, Lucy, I will hand to you. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just bringing my slides up. Apologies, Chair. While I share slides, I can't see any hands. So as Katie said, my plan is to pause at kind of key points and open it up to comments. But if you can help me work through any hands, that would be really appreciated. So for those that don't know, yeah,
I will keep my eye open for hands for you.
Great, thank you. Yes, so I'm Lucy Jakes. I'm Principal Policy and Strategy Development Officer at Transport for the North, for anyone that doesn't know me. And I've been leading on our second strategic transport plan work for the last couple of years, really. So as Katie said, today we're here to talk about kind of the emerging feedback from our consultation. I want to kind of pause a little bit to talk a little bit around some of those overarching themes and our initial thinking in terms of how we might kind of respond or work through those as we revise the document ahead of bringing it back through governance in November and December this year. And then there's a little bit of work that Katie's going to talk partners through in terms of some further work we're going to be doing with our partners around implementation as well. So that's kind of the three themes of the consultation. I'm not going to cover all of these slides in detail. They are in the deck, but I'll just pull out some kind of key slides and headlines to talk through really as we go. So our consultation, we've completed our statutory 12-week consultation, and that ran through from the end of May through to the 17th of August. And in total, we received 647 responses. And you can see the breakdown of those responses and the engagement that we had throughout on the slide and in the cover paper. I must say that that's more responses than we had as part of the STP1 consultation. So I think that's a mark of the engagement this time around, and perhaps more awareness around TAFN and the promotion that we've done throughout to try and encourage feedback. And I think there was a few kind of different aspects to our consultation approach this time it's worth just mentioning, and Scrutiny Committee members being aware of. So we purposefully tried to focus our activities this time around, so trying to make the best use of our resources really. So as part of that, we had a bit of a mixed methods approach, which we agreed with our board back in March. And that included the use of a virtual consultation room, which included all of our materials that sit alongside our plan, the consultation questions as well. And that was kind of one of the core forums. But in addition to that, we undertook 3 face-to-face meetings in Manchester, Leeds and Newcastle. And those were workshops as well. So they weren't just a case of show and tell, but they were very much engaged sessions where for all of those attendees, they had an opportunity to feedback throughout on key aspects of the plan and give their feedback, and all of that feedback ultimately is fed into the consultation report that's currently being worked up by our consultant Zarup, as well as again we did a virtual workshop as well. So in total we had 144 attendees at those sessions, so they were much better received than the range of sessions we did last time. In addition, we got a number of responses, obviously via email, letters from members of the public, from key stakeholders, as well as some of our statutory consultees. And we also did an all-party parliamentary group briefing in Whitehall. And as part of all of that, throughout the 12 weeks, Katie, myself and a number of other colleagues from TFN have also attended a series of partner events and meetings to promote the consultation, and again to seek views from kind of key stakeholders throughout. And all of that feedback has been fed back into the process as well. So that's included the business community through chambers of commerce and local enterprise partnerships. It's included roundtables with environmental stakeholders, with public health stakeholders, and then also attending various different local transport authority committees and member briefings as partners requested. So quite an extensive process, but all of that feedback's ultimately feeding back into our consultation. So I'll pause there briefly because I know that there's some questions around process, and then we'll get into the detail a little bit more.
Yeah, Councillor Dobson, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask, whilst the range of consultation is impressive, the numbers may be a little disappointing. Do we have a sense of the distribution of these numbers across the region? So, for example, I'm sitting at the very periphery of the north of England, and I wonder whether the people in this part of the world were properly represented in these responses from the public. Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Councillor. We do have that as part of the further analysis that's being undertaken. So we don't have that for obviously those that attended the face-to-face virtual events, etc., or those that sent correspondence via letter or email, because people often don't provide that. But we do have that at least for the virtual consultation room. So we do have that demographic analysis by region, by sex, and by some other kind of key criteria as well, which has been really valuable for us, and was something as we went through the consultation as well, we were keeping an eye on to try to think about perhaps where we focus some push activities to try and encourage more responses, whether that be asking our partners to help us further promote it in certain areas, or perhaps reaching out to key stakeholder groups. So, for example, throughout the consultation, we know, and it's not surprising for consultations like this, it's quite difficult sometimes to engage perhaps with women and also with ethnic groups. So again, we try to reach out to specific stakeholder groups to try to make sure that their views are reflected as well.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Is that okay, Councillor Dobson?
Yes, thank you. I look forward to seeing that data.
Thank you very much. Councillor Parish.
I think the response that is most depressing is 9 MPs from the region attended out of, what, 150 from the whole area. That does sound rather disappointing.
Perhaps I can comment on that, Chair. So we have an all-party parliamentary group, Transport Across the North. We did invite all of the Northern MPs to join us at a session in Portcullis House back in the summer. It was a drop-in session to be as flexible as possible, recognising how challenging MPs' diaries can be. We were pleased to get 9 MPs. I have to say, a real geographical split from right across the north. But what we did do was obviously provide sort of separate briefing and materials, and had been promoting it through our other channels as well. I think the other couple of points I might just pull out and add to is I think we've had an excellent response across all of the local transport authorities across the north of England. And similarly, when I think it was pleasing to see that we had a greater engagement this time round than we did previously, and certainly there was a lot of work that we did through our social media channels and direct outreach, as Lucy mentioned, to get to people, and indeed what we were able to get through our citizens panel, which again has a very good geographical spread. I think the other area that might just be worth mentioning is this is quite a comparable response to other subnational transport bodies too. So when we've looked at a couple of the other STBs across the country that have consulted on their strategies in recent times, that the numbers are comparable there. So we did invite all the MPs. We tried to be as flexible as we could, and you know, we'll continue running the APPG on key topics as we move forward. But thank you for raising. I hope that helps provide some context.
Thank you very much, Katie. Councillor Davison.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a disappointing number given the population size, but not surprising. Many of us that have been involved in consultations know that, you know, the getting the public, Joe Soap public, not pressure organisations, to take part in these things is tough. And generally most people don't. I mean, otherwise we'd have a huge number of responses. The thing that concerns me is that, and it really leads on perhaps from the earlier question about the representation. I'd be interested to know how much of this 600 and odd responses are from obviously statutory bodies like bus operators, you would hope, and local authorities, etc., and MPs, to be honest, would participate in this as part of their job almost, and duty. Getting the public to respond is tough. What you tend to get from my experience is the pressure groups popping up. So you'll get the net zero brigade, you'll get the anti-car brigade. So my interest really is how much of that 600 is, in each of the categories I've just described. MPs, local authorities, operators, stakeholders, as you call them, and how many are actually from your average Joe Soap public, who are the vast majority. I'm particularly concerned now because, you don't have to be following much press to realise there is now a backlash against all of us paying for net zero. We see it in London. So I think the majority of your average public don't want to be forced out of the car until there is actually a credible public service going for buses, trains, trams, whatever. And I do think people are waking up to the absurdity now to a certain degree of pushing electric cars. Thankfully, and I raised it some time ago, they're now publicising the actual pollution caused by brakes and tyres and the damage to roads caused by the additional weight, not to say, the risk of some of the multi-stories falling down. So I think, being responsive, a lot of this obviously is based on our big push for net zero, carbon free. Are we going to respond to what I think is an increasing public backlash against a lot of these policies? And if you look across Europe and now some of the rumblings from government, pushing back a lot of these deadlines as well. So it's a question really that I think we should be addressing.
Shall I make a start? And Lucy, please jump in. I think first and foremost, I want to just flag the 220 responses there from our citizens panel. They are all members of the public. They are a panel of people in different communities, places across the north of England. So they are all members of the public. And similarly, we had 94, as it says there as well, around direct emails and letters. So there was definitely a good representation, in my view, from the public. I think the challenge with a strategy like this is actually who it's written for. And it's written very much in mind to support and guide in the work of local transport authorities, but also to the Secretary of State. And at that sort of strategic level, thinking about the outcomes and the ambitions for the region, and perhaps with the detail, the implementation, which will sit separately, I think the response that we got was fair for the nature of the document itself. Your point, though, Councillor, on the environmental groups is not one that's lost on us. I think we've seen the narrative of changing in the media recently around that. And actually, we did have environmental groups come back to us on this. We had a number of them from across the region share their thoughts around the importance of decarbonisation and the decarbonisation strategy. But we also importantly tested through the consultation room, through the workshops and directly with the citizens panel, the importance of the three ambitions in the strategic transport plan. And Lucy will touch on those in a moment, but they were all seen equally important: economic growth, decarbonisation and transport related social exclusion. Interestingly as well, what we did find was what came through was about having the right choices. And it was the carrot and stick that I've talked about a few times with partners over this consultation. So there is recognition that we want to provide more choice on public transport. That's absolutely got to be there. And it's got to be there because of actually having that carrot to help people make different choices. Think about going by bus or going by train instead of using their car. And that again came through in the consultation in terms of having some of that choice. And again, we'll touch a little bit on that in a moment. So I think for a consultation that actually we recognise was going to be of interest to some of our statutory partners. So if I think about local transport authorities offering us responses, we see those as the LTA responding on behalf of their community and actually offering those views and thoughts as well. So again, a high number of those responded back to us too, the big key authorities. So I hope that gives you a flavour that actually the public are in there, the statutory consultees are in there, and actually some of the bodies that are representing the public are in there. And actually decarbonisation has remained as strong and important as it always has been, but it needs to be underpinned with choices that are really credible for the public.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just an observation. I think from my experience of citizen panels, they are still filled with people that have got axes to grind and have got a keen interest in some of the environmental issues. So I do still think, whilst, yeah, they are members of the public, they have put themselves forward to be on these committees, but generally people that do so have got strong opinions one way or the other. And in my opinion, don't necessarily represent the mass of the population, which are the people who are now rebelling. So,
thank you very much, John.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Connell, please.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we've had one Daily Mail manifesto and we're going to get another one. Obviously, you've got the figures here, but if you want to rubbish the findings before they've even gone through them, that's what you'll do. I would be glad if we could move on to the actual content of the report before too long, rather than querying its validity. That point is understood.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Connell. I just really wanted to make sure this didn't effectively pollute the main debate. I've got Councillor Markley, please.
Thank you. Quite interesting how Katie there mentioned the people have the choice of travelling on a bus or in their own car. Well, funny enough, upon the Solway Firth, which I represent, the choice of that is actually declining. It's gone because the bus services are knocking off. The rural areas are being very, very, left to find your own way. And it is a bit of an issue. I mean, they've just knocked the one off between Silloth and Maryport, and we managed to save the bonus on Solway Wall, the one. But these are main routes for the tourism industry as well, and the rural areas. And it is a big issue that somehow or another we've got to get across to government to be able to sort that one out if we can somehow or another. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Markley. I'm going to take, we'll keep your remark for the next piece, if that's okay. Are there any more comments on the consultation itself? Councillor Salter.
Thank you, Chairman. My internet's been dropping in and out, so I may have missed a bit of the conversation, but I just was interested to speak very quickly when there was sort of this conversation about whether the sample of the public was that representative, and concerns that maybe in terms of the environmental picture it may be out of line with what the general public feel. I would just want to say very briefly that I think that the consultation is very interesting, but I would also be inclined to think that it does give a sort of impression that we should be moving to reduce car travel in a way that may switch members of the public off to a certain extent amongst the wider public. So I think there's a sense in which what we've got is very useful information. We can't take it absolutely as representing all of the public in general, but I just wanted to say that very briefly as a sort of add to some of the conversation that seems to have been happening.
Thank you very much, Councillor Salter. Right, I think, Katie, Lucy, I think we can move on to the main part of your debate. I'm delighted that we've had an improvement in the consultation, but like everything, it carries a caveat. Depending on who you ask, you'll get a different answer. Of course, Henry Ford once said that if I'd asked my customers, they'd have wanted faster horses instead of the car that he produced. So back to you, Lucy.
Great, thank you, Chair, and thanks for those comments. I'm not going to touch on this slide. It's mainly in the deck just to remind you what our vision was in the draft plan, our 3 strategic ambitions that sit underneath it, and the right share targets, because we'll come back to that shortly when we talk through some of that feedback. So I think this is the key of the conversation today, really, around, what were the overarching themes coming from the consultation? And as I say, I do need to give the caveat that we're still completing the analysis on the consultation. So we're doing some quality assurance of that. But these are the emerging kind of themes that have come throughout, and I just wanted to kind of briefly kind of talk some of this through. In a few places I can start to draw out perhaps how we might, some of the recommendations we might make to board in terms of options, in terms of how we revise the document. And again, would be good to sense check this, I guess, with the committee today in terms of their views and thoughts or thoughts of their constituents. So, you know, a really key theme throughout all of the consultation was around whether the targets are ambitious enough within the plan. So we've got those 3 strategic ambitions, and then underneath that we've got a series of headline and core and supplementary metrics that make up our full suite of monitoring and evaluation, kind of our monitoring and evaluation framework that will underpin our plan and help us track our progress over time. So there's a number of areas within that where you know, particularly members of the public, but some partners as well, we're just questioning whether or not we've been ambitious enough within some of those targets. So some thoughts around whether or not we should look to go further faster on some of those. So bringing some of those target dates sooner. So from 2050, perhaps looking to put an interim milestone in at 2030 for some of the indicators. Now we have that for some, we don't have that for all. And part of that is around the data available and also recognising when benefits might be realised, which is a really key point. But it's certainly something we've been looking at. And there's a couple of targets specifically that repeatedly have been brought up in the consultation that we're now doing some work to explore in more detail. The first is around those right share targets, so the mode shift targets that we'd look to set, and whether or not they're ambitious enough. So are we going far enough? And some examples of perhaps what some other partners have done in this space have been provided to us to kind of relook at really. So that's certainly something we're going to go away and explore in more detail and present some options back to board later this month. The other one is around the transport related social exclusion target. So for that one, we've looked to reduce that by 1 million by 2050 from the 3.3 million people currently at high risk of TRSE in the north. And the rationale behind that is really quite clear. It's about addressing the gap between the north and other parts of the country. But again, there's some kind of challenge around whether actually should we be looking to eradicate that, and that's certainly something we need to kind of consider. And the final one around that was around the Vision Zero, the safety on the road network target. So again, we've set that target to 2050. And some questions around whether or not that date should be brought sooner. So under all of that, we're currently working through the detail and looking at what options might be available. But I think it is really important to stress at this point to Scrutiny Committee that ultimately these targets have to be smart. So if we're following the Green Book and the Magenta Book and government's guidelines about how you develop a strategy and targets and ambitions, you know, they need to be smart. So they need to be specific, they need to be measurable, they need to be achievable, realistic, and they need to be time bound. And so they were all really key criteria when we set our original targets with our partners. I guess the other point to make as well is the TFN, the challenge we have is obviously we've got such a plethora of partners. We've got 21 local transport authorities that sit in our patch. We need to recognise that in setting any of our targets, it needs to be something that shows ambition and allows our partners and us to communicate to government where we want to be, but also that we're not penalising certain areas that perhaps it might be more difficult for them to find some of the solutions or to deliver on some of these targets. So it's a really tricky balance we have to find. But that said, we've certainly done that before. We've done that in setting the draft targets. We've done that in setting, for example, our commitment to decarbonisation through our decarb strategy. So there is a way to work through this, but we're just looking at the further detail to present some options back to board and perhaps how we might be more ambitious moving forward. Some feedback, particularly from some of those environmental stakeholders, their feeling is perhaps we're not meeting our carbon targets. And I think one of the key things that's come out of that is perhaps a misunderstanding of actually what TFN's future travel scenarios are there for and how they should be used. So that was kind of a consistent message, the thought that our carbon targets aren't delivering on our future travel scenarios or our TFN decarbonisation targets. And I think some of that is about a misunderstanding about how these tools layer and are used in terms of informing transport planning. And so certainly something we're looking at, but equally it's something that we need to kind of reaffirm actually how these things fit together and how they work. So that's some further work for us. A really prominent theme throughout the consultation is about the affordability of transport. So, and I think it's probably fair to say this has been a bit of an omission in terms of the strategy at this point, and mainly because it's really difficult to know what TfN's role is in this space. You know, with the amount of partners we've got and the powers we've got, it's quite tricky for TfN to navigate affordability and what a TfN position on this might be. That said, though, we have behind the scenes been taking that feedback up that we've received through the consultation and starting to explore this topic in a bit more detail. So we've started to collate our existing evidence base around affordability, and we certainly do have some evidence from our transport related social exclusion work, from our recent cost of living work that will inform a strengthened narrative around this in the final document about why affordability of transport is important. And we've also been exploring internally perhaps what else we might need to do as TfN to build the evidence base further, but also to work with our partners to think about perhaps do we need to develop a TfN position on this in a bit of slower time outside of the STP, and if so, what do we need to consider as part of that and what the challenge is. So we've started to map all of that out, and we're hoping to have conversations with our executive board into the autumn to kind of explore that a little bit more as part of business planning. But just to say, you know, I think in the final STP, our plan is to include some strengthened text about affordability, particularly in the Case for Change chapter, why that's important, and also perhaps look to include an action to do some further work in this space next financial year to kind of bring this together and work with our partners to understand what TfN position might be around this. Similarly, bus and coaches, again, they are featured in our plan. But when we were drafting the plan, you know, TfN at that point hadn't had the conversation yet with our executive board around what they wanted us to do in this space. And again, it's one of those topics where historically, you know, it hasn't been within TfN's kind of remit, and some partners have had some hesitance from us to kind of work in this space. I would say over the last kind of year or so that certainly has changed. The rhetoric on that from partners has changed, and there's an increased demand for us to explore and see how we can kind of support making a better case for bus and coaches in the north, and joining up some of that activity. So we need to strengthen the text around this in the document. And again, based on what we'd agreed with executive board, there's an ongoing piece of work to develop a bus position and to provide some advice, statutory advice back to government around what's needed here. So again, we'll strengthen some wording around that. Rural areas and thinking about different places, so strengthening the text around that, which we certainly can look at the document. We need to strengthen the text, but they're certainly there in terms of metrics as part of our M&E framework that sits alongside the plan. So there's a whole raft of metrics that sit alongside it beyond that headline decarbonisation commitment we've made. So I think there's a little bit there around better communicating that and making sure that's clearer within the plan. Katie talked a little bit before about behavioural change. That's a massive theme in the plan, and again a recognition throughout that absolutely is going to be critical to delivering on this plan. So it's about how we support mode shift behavioural change and how we make sure that's kind of front and centre within the plan, as well as improvements to public transport integration. Freight and logistics, we've had some really good feedback around this, but certainly feedback that says we need to make a stronger case for freight and logistics within the document, and also potentially explore some further work around multimodal freight hubs, but also strengthening the wording around the opportunities of inland waterways as well for freight and logistics. So some further work there to strengthen that part of the plan. And then more generally, some feedback around, I guess, how TfN operates, so how we collaborate with stakeholders, how we make sure that we're voice and how we do that so that our message is heard loud and clear in the right places. And again, I think with fair criticism, some comments throughout about our ability to deliver. And I think that's fair, because I think with this plan, working with our board, we made a conscious decision that this is about developing the strategy and what outcomes we want to see, and that we would do further work with our partners in slower time to start to think about, well, what's the delivery plan, what's the implementation proposition that needs to sit alongside this SDP. And that's work that we've kick-started with our partners and will continue over the summer into the autumn, ahead of taking a proposition back to our board in December. And Katie will touch on some of that work a little bit later. I won't cover these slides in too much detail, but these just give you a bit of an at-a-glance view, I guess, of the sentiments received, both from the public consultation room, the virtual room, but also from our statutory consultees, partners, stakeholder groups such as Logistics UK and the Chartered Institute for Highways and Transportation, and some of those kind of core groups. So it gives you an at-a-glance view of kind of what their views were on key elements of our plan. And I think generally it's really positive. Actually, there's a lot of kind of agreement for what we've got in the plan. The disagree section isn't huge, but there's certainly some areas which we've highlighted in red, that we think we just need to go back and relook at and think about how we strengthen. I think the main message for us in terms of areas where, actually the feedback kind of suggests that partners and the public didn't really understand two of the core documents that supported the plan, and those were the integrated sustainability appraisal and the habitats regulation assessment that sit alongside the plan. Now, they were produced independently for us by our consultants, ARUP, but I think there's been something around, they're quite technical documents, and again, there's some feedback we've received as part of this around people not really understanding what those documents, what their purpose is and how they should be considered. So again, that's some work that we're undertaking to try and strengthen that and make sure that exec summary is really clear and improved ahead of finalising. Again, I wasn't planning to kind of talk through these, but I just included a couple of slides on the vision, on the strategic ambitions, and on roads as well, just to give Scrutiny Committee a sense of how the feedback's coming through for each section. So as I say, our consultants are frantically working away, analysing the data and quality assuring it at the moment. So it's a very much watch this space. But as I say, under each of those themes, if you go back to the percentages, what we'll have in our final report and what we've already got indications on is for each section where there's kind of core areas for us to perhaps look at, or what the kind of key feedback has been. So for example, for the vision, generally lots of support and alignment with our local partners, kind of ambitions and vision. Again, as I've touched on, some thought around, not just talking about decarbonisation, but actually thinking about wider metrics that sit alongside that. But also, making sure that mode shift is clearer within the vision, the importance of public transport, and again, that point around ambition that I talked before about. With strategic ambitions, as Katie said, one of the key kind of bits of emerging feedback we've received through this is actually, in general, the consultations found that all three of our strategic ambitions, so decarbonisation, social inclusion and economic growth, are all seen as kind of relatively equal and of equal importance. And I think that's quite interesting, because again, as the consultation kind of played out, depending on the audience at key face-to-face events or key stakeholders we were engaging with, those views did differ depending on the groups we were speaking to. But it was really good to kind of sense check this overall and get that kind of sense that they're all of equal importance. They're actually all relatively interlinked, actually. And so that's quite an important message we've received through the consultation in terms of how we think about those things. Generally, again, lots of support and alignment. Again, thinking about decarbonisation, but the breadth of what we consider as part of that. So thinking more generally about biodiversity, sustainability, the environment. And again, actually, and this was a really key message from our citizens, actually, surprisingly, about the economy being just as important, actually. So our citizens panel kind of found that was really up there for them as a priority, perhaps more so than decarbonisation. So again, going back to some of the earlier comments from councillors, I guess that plays into it a little bit more around what the public's view of some of these topics are versus perhaps what us as officials working in the field, what our view might be. Again, on roads, I won't go into this in too much detail, but I think it's fair to say, there's been a mixed view on roads, and it's not something that has surprised us. All of the feedback kind of aligns to where we know the narrative is around roads. So lots of mixed views around, some partners and stakeholders recognising the value of needing further improvements in roads in particular areas, and making sure that there's improved capacity and resilience, etc. Whereas obviously other stakeholders, challenging, I guess, our position on roads a bit, thinking about the environmental implications of that. So I think for us, in this space, there's some work to do around just sense checking our narrative. Have we got that balance right? But I think fundamentally, this just kind of supports where we ended up in the draft plan in terms of there's such a mixed plethora of views on this topic. I think generally where we've ended up is that kind of balanced middle ground, really, around recognising that, roads need to be sustainable. We need to be thinking about how we use our roads and communicating their kind of different use. So it's about, perhaps some of the work that's needed is about the reallocation of road space, for example, but also recognising, we do need to in certain places support capacity and resilience on the road network as well, to support some of the other ambitions. So it's about trying to find that balance between that. And then finally, again, just playing back the workshop summary, as I say, from the virtual and the face-to-face workshops, for us as officers, they've been really valuable, just to work through kind of key questions. And, all of those sessions, different themes came up, but there were certainly consistent themes that really mirror actually the themes I talked about earlier. So for us as officers, they've been an early indication, because the workshops happened in June and in early July, for us to start to explore some of these topics like affordability, etc., that I talked about earlier. So I'll pause there before I kind of talk a little bit more about the citizens panel and what the public actually specifically thought about key elements.
Thank you, Lucy. I'd like to open this up now to questions. Whilst people are just putting their hands together and putting their hands up, I've got a couple of things that I'd like to just add. For me, this theme of a lack of, or what I call a lack of ambition, it's an interesting thing, because you've got the ambition that you're getting to carbon net zero, and yet it's not perceived as ambitious enough. And I actually don't perceive it as ambitious enough. And I'm just going to give you three things that I'm going to throw out there. And then hopefully my colleagues will either join in and say that I'm out of touch, or that they want more of it. And the three things that I would throw in are the air quality and health and well-being. So there's more to this than just decarbonisation. Fighting climate change is not just about purely finding a different energy source. And while we're on energy sources, in North Yorkshire, and I'm being parochial, but there are other big counties like ourselves, only 3% of the county is accessible by train. Now that 3% is really used hard, but there's no way that anybody's going to lay a load of rail track in the immediate future. So we need to be looking at other things. And we already have our first hydrogen fuel station opening on, I think it's already opened on the A1. And there's another one, I think, opening on the A66. So I think there's got to be something that says, how does our road network work with hydrogen fueled vehicles? The second point I'd like to make is about affordability. And I think we have to actually make a point about affordability. At the moment, we've got this wonderful £2 bus fare, which is doing great for the Harrogate. Again, I'm sorry to be parochial, but Harrogate to Leeds buses, which is about 17 miles, it's £2. But in my area, for a family of 4 to travel on the bus into Harrogate, and it's a mile and a half, before anybody says they should walk, it's £2 each. So suddenly that's £8. It's much cheaper to either drive or take a taxi. So there's something around the affordability issue that we have to look at. As say, one other thing just mentioned is freight. I think we need to look at how freight moves around, but maybe we can tie this into the bus service. So why can't freight go by bus? So if you had a regular bus service, why isn't the freight just tagged in the back? It might only be a few packages for Tesco's or whatever. Or so let's try and think, for want of that terrible business speak word, out of the box. And finally, I don't think there's any getting away from this. The amount of money spent on transport in the north of England compared to the south of England is completely disproportionate. And, we have to, you cannot get away from not mentioning that. If we don't level up, we'll never achieve any of our climate change ambitions or any of our economic ambitions. So that's me just starting you all off. So I will now go to, I think is it Fina? Councillor Hornby, please.
Chair, just before we open up, may I just make a couple of suggestions? Perhaps we could just ask Lucy to stop sharing for a moment, just so we can see everybody while we have the full the commentary. And I'm just wondering if it might be helpful to sort of take all the comments, and then perhaps Lucy and I can come back and respond in one go. Is that acceptable to you, Chair?
I think that's a much better idea, because I'm sure that people will come in and say that I'm off piece, or other people have other ideas. So I think it is best that we gather them up at the end. So I'll bring you in, Councillor Hornby.
Thank you. My name's Councillor Fiona Hornby. I'm the councillor for Gorse Hill and Cornbrook ward in Trafford. I just wanted to feedback that I found it really interesting that the feedback highlighted that the plan needs to make a stronger case for free. I just wanted to flag that there needs to be a really careful balance of how that works across different locations. I represent the ward home to Trafford Park, and a lot of my casework's based off the profound effect that having free in communities, especially residential areas, can have on those areas. So it'd be good to see if we can give any advice there on best practice in terms of locations for freight development to lessen the burden on our residents.
Thank you. That's great. I know that park you're referring to. I used to live in Manchester. So over to you, Councillor Salter, please.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I just wanted to make a few brief comments. I think the first one is that I'm very supportive of the sort of overarching themes and that have been picked out, and I think that seems like a good way to sort of look at how we tweak and adjust the strategic transport plan. The next point I would make is I fully agree with what's been said about freight and about hydrogen. And I sort of suspect that there is, I know that there is a lot of analysis that has already been done on freight. I think there has been analysis already done on hydrogen. So to a certain extent, I think that there's a risk that we aren't making enough of the work that Transport for the North has already done and is continuing to do. So I think that that's something that hopefully more attention can be given to. And the last comment I'd make is that in terms of lack of ambition, well, I would agree that there is a lack of ambition. The difficulty is I don't think that the fault for that lies with Transport for the North or with the work that Transport for the North have been doing, so much as that unfortunately there has been perhaps less enthusiasm from central government as there once were for this, and I think that we need the message to be, politely, appropriately, whatever put across that, in a sense, I'm sure that Transport for the North would love to do a lot more for decarbonisation, for economic development, for challenging social isolation, whatever. But perhaps we need a bit more support from central government to take it to the next level.
Thank you, Matthew. Councillor Melly, please.
Hi. This is my first meeting of this committee, so I'm kind of coming at this a bit fresh. I haven't been involved with the process up until now. But I do agree with what's already been said about the carbon reduction targets maybe not being ambitious enough, or maybe the targets are ambitious enough but the strategy doesn't meet them. And so what's the point in having the targets? Presumably you established what the targets were first that the strategy needs to meet, and then you design the strategy to meet those targets. So if the strategy doesn't meet those targets, then something in the strategy needs to change. And then I also wanted to make a point about buses, because I was expecting to see more about buses, as an essential transport service and strategically important. But the point that was just made about it being quite affordable because of the current £2 fare cap scheme, it's quite affordable to get from Leeds to Harrogate by bus. Well, I'm from York, which is another, important city, similar distance to Harrogate as Leeds is, but you can't get the bus from York to Harrogate. So if the service doesn't exist, then you can't use it. So I think that sort of thing is exactly why it needs to be part of the strategy, looking at, all aspects of transport, how they're integrated. And when you're looking at affordability and that sort of thing, you also need to look at, availability and where the services exist and where it's missing to, strategic networks.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and welcome. We value fresh views all the time. Councillor Davison.
Thank you, Chair. Well, can I say, I don't want to come across as dissing this report at all. And I think when you look at the views we've got, they are pretty representative. So, not taking away from my comments about the validity of the number of responses and where they came from, the responses that have come out are good. So, which is good news. They're a fairly mixed and varied set of responses. I think my view on buses, because I'm surprised it's not been more of a mention, is the very big difference between authorities that are largely urban or have within an urban range, as we've said, Harrogate to Leeds or whatever, where you've got quite a large demographic and a good bus service, to those of us that have largely rural communities, where actually providing any bus service at all is a real challenge. Government provided some funding for us. We used it in North Links to set up a revised DRT service. Now that money has run out and there's no more forthcoming from the government, of course, the sustainability of that is in question. And that's because people basically don't use it. And this is the big conundrum, really, that we've got in the rural areas, that it's use it or lose it. So I don't think councils are ever going to have enough funding to actually subsidise the rural routes that people expect. And that's the biggest challenge for me. We'd love to have buses going out into these remote communities so that people can come in and shop and go to the main centres, but it's proving increasingly difficult, and I don't really see any policies as how we're going to address that particularly, because it's all about money. Many councils are basically held to ransom by one or two private operators like Stagecoach, and they can pull services at any time unless they get the subsidy they demand. So we're certainly wrestling with that in North Links, and it's very difficult to see a way out of it at the moment. And we certainly don't have the money to subsidise Stagecoach and running a load of buses that probably have 3 people on. So that's a conundrum, I think, that doesn't address. And obviously, when you look at the urban centres, a very different picture. You can integrate transport, you can join up buses with trams and trains. It's a much easier picture. And but a lot of us are in rural community settings where the policies ain't going to work. So that's just an observation. I don't know quite how we're going to, find the money to deliver that. And it's all about, it's great having policies, but are we ever going to deliver the goods? The other observation really is that you're looking at people's views on reducing car usage seem at odds to putting loads of money into the road network. Now, obviously, we want the roads we've got to be well maintained and try and alleviate traffic jams. But the more we improve the road system, the less likely it is people are going to abandon their cars. So there is a slight contradiction, I think, between how far you're going in really improving our highways against the aim of getting people out of cars. So I could go on, but I won't. So there's just a few points there I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Davison. You make some very valid points. Thank you. Councillor Markley, please.
Thank you. Yes, totally agree about the rural areas. It is a big issue. And as an ex-haulage contractor and an ex-coach proprietor who operated 20, 30 vehicles in this range of things, it's an issue I fully appreciate and know. Purchasing a vehicle is an extreme cost. Running a vehicle is an extreme cost. And if you have no punters in it to make it pay, well, you just can't do it. So somewhere along the line, the levelling up has got to be that the rural and the urban is different, because in the urban, the people using the buses all the time, so they're profitable, but in the rural areas, they're not. So why should the rural people be done away with? It's not fair, really. It's a bit like use it or lose it, which has actually happened out in the rural areas. So, I mean, we do have to look at that and address it, because there are some communities that do need them. On the other thing about electric vehicles, has anybody ever thought of how many vehicles you see operating along the roads? Possibly not. When I was operating vehicles, I ran them 24 hours a day, 2 drivers on them. So how the heck am I going to charge that vehicle up after I've spent maybe 150, 200,000 pounds buying it? It runs for 12 hours, but it's got to be charged up again. But I would expect to get that vehicle to do another 12 hours through the night. So you can't do it. You can go and fill it up with diesel, or you can go and fill it up with anything else, but you can't charge it because it's going to take a lot of charging. And also, the price of purchasing a charging system to operate these vehicles is massive. So the smaller operator is being knocked backwards again. Big operators can do it, but the smaller. But if you want to utilise that asset to operate 24 hours a day, you can't charge them up because it's not the charging system, it's not there quick enough. Just an observation that people are maybe not aware of, but it's something you've got to rely on and remember. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Markley. I think it's very important. I think one of the other things when it comes to assets is just the car that we have parked on our drive for probably 93% of its life, and how do we better use those assets as well. So some well-made comments there. Councillor Fletcher, please.
Thank you. Yes. I think the problem with it's very good to make these proposals by 2050, but it has to be funded. And funding seems to be getting cut for public transport all the time. And what does concern me is, I think it's for 40 years now, as having a councillor, people have been saying we should take more traffic off the roads and put it on the rail. They've been saying that for 40 years, and basically what's happened is the reverse seems to be happening. Now, near where I live in South Cheshire, there used to be a private siding, and the vehicles used to come out of that private siding and go into crew marshalling yards and go forward on trains. Now that siding tripped up. The vehicles go out of this factory on containers and driven by road to Trafford Park, which to me seems rather stupid, but that's the way it is now. And I think the local ward member needn't be too worried about an increase in services, because I think the Castlefield corridor is maxed out anyway, so I don't think there's going to be any additional services for Trafford Park. But basically, we should be trying to, at least in my opinion, we should be trying to take traffic off the road and put it onto rail. But there's no capacity on the rail network at this moment, and until HS2 is completed, I can't see an increase. And whenever HS2 will be completed, probably not in my lifetime, I just don't know. But also, again, the local member for Trafford Park raises an interesting point. These new freight rail hubs, where are they going to be? Are they going to be in city centres, town centres, or are they going to put them in rural areas? But if you put them in rural areas, a new freight liner terminal, say, in a rural area, it arrives with all these containers in a rural area, then you've got to put them onto lorries to take them into the centre of the town or city. So there's a lot of questions on this. You have got some very good information, But my concern again is it's going to be funding it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rod. Are there any more questions before I offer Lucy and Katie a chance to come back having absorbed our comments? Councillor Hornby, please.
Hiya, I just wanted to say, I know several people have mentioned with regards to buses, use it or lose it. I just wanted to see if there's actually any evidence that the usage dropping is why bus services have declined, or if it is because services have stopped because of companies and whatnot. I just think I wouldn't like us to be misleading on that if that's not the case.
Thank you very much. We'll get that question. We'll try and answer that question for you.
Yes, shall I offer some reflections if there's no further comments?
That would be perfect, Katie, and anything else you require from us.
No, that's great. I'll make a start, but I'll invite Lucy to jump in if I miss anything. I mean, I think first of all, thank you for taking the time to digest what we've shared with you this morning and the pack that came in advance. And I'm hearing generally that you're understanding what the feedback is that we've received through the consultation, and you recognise much of it as well. And that's a helpful steer for us as we continue with the analysis around what we do with it. I'll come to Darren in a moment, because we've got Darren Oldham with us this morning, who's our Roads and Rail Director, because we're having a very current debate about where TfN might add value and support in the whole bus conversation that we've touched on here. So I'll come to Darren in a moment. I think a couple of other observations I'd make. Chair, your comments around air quality, health and well-being, and those being linked into what we want to do around and our ambition around decarbonisation, that is something that has again come through the consultation, and we are keen to have a look at that narrative, recognising actually the health benefits that can come with decarbonisation too. I think on the freight points, where we've got to in talking with many partners through this consultation is the strategic transport plan is intended to set the long-term outcomes and ambitions that we want for the north of England. And ultimately, the STP will go to the Secretary of State for Transport as TfN's statutory advice to him. So what we're trying to think about is what do we need from our network, our transport network in the north of England to enable the effective movement of freight and logistics. So I think Councillor Hornby's point about actually how does this work where you've got somewhere like Trafford Park on your doorstep, vis-a-vis actually how we might make use of capacity that potentially does exist on some of our trains and in some of our lorries to actually, think about what are some of those quick wins or activities and interventions that we could take in the short term that might enable better and more frequent use of perhaps rail over road on freight where that's possible. I think though Councillor Fletcher's comments really about funding are central, and it's why one of the ambitions that we've got within the strategic transport plan is actually about the economic ambition and about the level of funding that is truly needed to support the ambition that could be unlocked in the north of England. And you'll probably recognise, and Lucy's slide showed at the start, that we've estimated through research that we've done with partners right the way across the north through all the local enterprise partnerships, that we could be looking at £118 billion per annum GVA growth above current levels if actually we could secure the transformational investment and the right policy levers to do that. And so again, the strategic transport plan is seeking to make that argument that actually this is where the north wants to be by 2050, but this is the investment that's going to be needed to help us get there. So we see that as integral. And I think finally, just to come back on before I hand to Darren on buses, I think the points around ambitions about the carbon reduction targets, those just for clarity, Councillor, they have come from our decarbonisation strategy that we agreed with partners across the north back in 2021 of having near zero surface emissions by 2045. It was a middle ground between some of the more ambitious authorities and some authorities that were perhaps going at a slightly different pace. But we are at the point now of wanting to start a review of that decarbonisation strategy, because that was done on pre-COVID data. Life has changed, the world has moved on, and it's important we complete that rebaselining and understand what else might be needed, what might be the other policy gaps that we need to fill to reach that ambition. And finally, I do need to just mention rural, because I think Councillor Markley's comments again are something that Lucy and I come across a lot of the time. And while we're talking about how we might use our roads differently, I think we have to remember still over 95% of the journeys we make are on roads. And actually, in some of the rural areas, perhaps that haven't got the access to railways and train stations, we've got to make sure that those roads function for good, effective public transport as well. So it's another reason why the STP is very much geared around thinking about people and places, because no place is the same. No person is the same, and actually what are the outcomes that we want? Because what might be needed in central Manchester is more likely going to be quite different to what you need in the North Lake district. So actually what we want to do with the STP is to set that framework about the ambition for the region, recognising those differences. And as we work through what implementation looks like, we want to work out how we can support at a regional level. But I think importantly, it's how the STP can hopefully help those local transport authorities with their own planning, because they're the ones that know the communities, the people and the places best. Darren, might I just invite you just to comment briefly on buses and where we've got with this work, because it's definitely an area, as Lucy said, that we're expecting to strengthen the narrative on within the STP, given the volume of feedback we've had.
Yeah, thank you for that, Katie. And just to endorse the comments that you were making there, particularly around the importance of the STP as an advocate for that investment in the north, which I think, we've all said in different ways on this call, how important that is. So, so moving on to buses, I think it's fair to say that this is an area where TfN recognises that we've needed to do significantly more work, and we've been looking over recent months as to how we can really step up into this area. It's a very interesting one, because we were unsure as to what level of appetite there was from our partners in terms of TfN taking a sort of an overarching sort of facilitator role, I guess, in terms of bus interventions. And it's fair to say that nearly universally we have had extremely positive feedback from across the north and elsewhere, be that DFT or other partners, about us trying to really help ourselves move forward in terms of bus activity. So an awful lot I could say here, but what I would just pick up on is from the partnership board yesterday, and 2 or 3 key elements that came out of that. We presented a number of papers around the key activities that we want to do for the rest of this year and 2024, and particular support for helping everyone across the north talk to one another, and what we can learn in terms of best practice and how we can actually help one another, where certain organisations are going through similar processes that others have just been through, particularly around areas around re-regulation or franchising and the like, and that's seen as really important. I think that the other really big one is around rural buses and social connectivity, and just what we can do there in terms of really making the case for the fundamental changes that can make to people's lives in terms of having effective ticketing, effective information, and actually making the best use of the services that we currently have. And a point that Mayor Burnham has made repeatedly to me is that the knowledge that he has now that he didn't have 12 months ago in terms of how to run bus operations, he said it feels it's transformational for him as a mayor in terms of some of the things that we need to do, and we're very keen to to distill that information to be able to then share that out across to all partners over the north. Some other ideas that have been put to us, which we will look at, is whether we could act as a facilitator for bus purchasing. This is a message that we've had repeatedly over recent weeks, in terms of, is there a way where we can actually help everyone here to have better cheaper buses, which actually work more effectively in terms of their acquisition and maintenance. That seems an important one. And I guess the fundamental message is, we need to, across the north, speak to one another more, talk about what's working well, what doesn't work so well, in terms of, bus activity, and really use that to make this crucial mode much more effective for all of the travelling public across the north. So, I think that we will see a very significant change in terms of how we communicate bus activity from TfN, over the rest of this year and into 2024. So much more to come on that. So hopefully that's given people a little bit of a flavour of some of the activities that we are intending to do.
Thanks, Darren. Lucy, I'm just going to check if there's anything else we needed to pick up from your perspective in response to councillors' comments.
No, I think you've both covered it.
Thank you, Lucy. So, Chair, I shall hand back to you. If there's any further points or reflections.
So I've got Councillor Connell, who's been very patiently waiting and typing away and sending messages. I can see. I'll bring you in, Councillor Connell.
Well, I've not sent too many messages. Anyway, thanks very much. I'll be brief. It's simply the question raised earlier about bus usage. Obviously, COVID, for understandable reasons, hit usage badly, and credit to government. It kept the bus services going by central funding, whether otherwise it would have collapsed because they just didn't have the bums on seats, they just didn't have the revenue. In my very limited experience of rural services, it is reviving now, and I think ridership is back to pre-COVID levels, by and large, on my observation. And I think the £2 adult fare has assisted in that process, and I must question whether there are many, if any, journeys where you could really make it cheaper by taxi. I just don't think you're right about that, but we won't argue on that particular one. Demand response transport, I have to say, though, on the other hand, is a government wheeze, which I think is nonsensical. The little evidence I have is it doesn't work, and it's something devised by people who don't understand public transport and don't use it. And I would urge councillors, if you don't use public transport, try using it before pronouncing about it, because it does help. I'll leave it there, other than to say there isn't much point in being at odds with your major provider if it's Stagecoach. Councils demonising Stagecoach gets you absolutely nowhere. I had to endure this on a county council for years. It doesn't help. Work with your provider in a common interest of getting the service used and as consonant with public requirements within the funding that you've got as you possibly can. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Connell. Some very useful comments there. Councillor Salter, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to come in very briefly on something that was discussed about, and we've discussed it a couple of times, about the tension that there's a theme of reducing car usage, but there's also the thought that the general public may not support that. And one thing I would say is that there's not always a tension between our climate objectives and at least having certain, car usage and investment in the roads. So I've mentioned Transport for the North before, but I do feel that, for instance, there was work on the Heysham motorway link that took a lot of traffic out of Lancaster town centre. That would have been about 10 years ago now. That would be an example of a project where there was substantial investment in the roads, but my contention would be that we probably saw less pollution, certainly less air pollution in Lancaster itself, benefits for underprivileged people, whatever. And as has been said, you know, in rural areas, there is a need to continue to have car travel. So I do think it's important that we always remember there are ways through electric vehicles, hydrogen, through sensible investment, whatever, that's always got to be part of the picture. And we should not be, you know, reducing our focus on the environment at all, but we hopefully can you know, sell the developments and the improvements in public transport, whatever, in a way that isn't seen as unnecessarily hostile to those who do need to use the roads for their livelihoods and whatever else.
Thank you very much, Councillor Salter. Councillor Connell, did you want to come back?
I thought I'd lower my hand, and no, I have no desire to say anything more.
Okay, that's fantastic. That's great. So I just have one comment to make, and then I was going to summarise, unless anybody else has any other views at the moment. Okay, so one of the things that one of the comments I would make, and just ask you to put it in your sort of back pocket, Katie, is, and this won't be a surprise to you because we discussed it last week, is I think we probably need to understand what going to work and school might look like in 2040 or 2050. At the moment, I don't know anybody who works in who's an office worker who actually goes into the office for more than 3 days a week anymore. And that strikes me as that could well be a permanent change. The other thing is that I'm reading now that universities are trying to create their curriculum and their lectures so that students only have to attend 3 days a week so they can get part-time jobs in order to deal with the cost of living. So I think it's important that, I don't know if you've got some soothsayers there or some sort of people that might know, or any time travellers that can just nip forward and have a look at what our demands might be in that time zone. And then the other, and just to comment on the roads, I think you know, sort of, they're actually, you know, there are certainly the arteries in some of the more rural constituencies. Although I'm in the Harrogate bit of North Yorkshire, I did spend some time last weekend in some of what I'd call, well, I almost got to Lancashire, but sort of Burton in Lonsdale. And, you know, the roads there are the lifeline for these people. But it could be that the future of the taxi, maybe the driverless taxi. And I think Councillor Markley made a very good point about the fact that he needs to make his freight work 100% of the time. If he's not working 80% of its life, he's not getting a return on it. And maybe we need to be looking at cars in that way. And if there is some way that can work, then maybe there's something there. Anyway, look, those are just a few musings of the chair, and that's chair's privilege, I suppose. What I'd like to do is just briefly summarise. I know you've got all the comments, but I would like to say that I believe this committee is very supportive of the work that's been done and how you've drawn things out. But we do think that there's probably room for more ambition. There's room for fueling options. Freight needs to be focused on, and public transport in the form of buses needs to be looked at, but perhaps it needs to be situation or place specific. So if you're in a rural area, is a much different question to if you're in the towns. And then, of course, it all goes back to, at the end of the day, where we getting the money from. Well, I've no kidneys left. I've sold most of mine, but yes, we will need to sort of find a way in which we can fund and raise the money for this. And I know that there's a future promise of all the gross value add that it will give, but we perhaps need to try and get a loan based on that, but we certainly need to make sure the funding is in place so that we deliver complete projects. But unless anybody else has got to say anything, I will move to the next item on the agenda. Thank you.
Councillor, thank you. Great to have the summary. I think I'm just going to, if it's okay with you, I was going to hand back to Lucy just to take us through the citizens panel work very briefly. given that was an important part of the consultation. But did you want us to do that, or would you like us to move straight to next steps?
No, Lucy, please complete your mission.
That would be good. I think it'd just be worth touching it because it was important. And I would finally just point to the future. We are about to kick off work to update our future travel scenarios, which give us a framework to appraise and think about different policies. So we will be engaging as we shape those over the autumn and into the spring. Lucy, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Committee. Really valuable feedback. I am conscious of time now, so I'll just briefly kind of give you a bit of a flavour of some of the feedback we've received through the Citizens Panel, because I think it plays to some of the comments that Scrutiny Committee members have raised there and gives us some really useful insight we can use moving forward to explore some of these issues in more detail. And then, as I say, Katie wanted to just give you a bit of a flavour of next steps in terms of implementation and how we explore that with our partners. So I appreciate there's a number of new Scrutiny Committee members today. So for those that don't know, our Northern Transport Voices is TfN's Citizens Panel, and it's made up of 550 members of the public that broadly represent the social demographic kind of makeup of the North. And we've been using this to explore a number of different policy areas over the last 6 months or so, to get a sense from the public as to their views or appetite for certain things. So some of the topics we've previously explored through our panel include things such as first and last mile for freight delivery. So what's the public's attitude around some of that? We've explored in more detail and developed some travel diaries for rural citizens to understand how they're travelling now and what's influencing their travel choices, along with a number of other activities. But what we wanted to do as part of our consultation, and recognising, as we said earlier, you do a transport consultation like this and it is really difficult to get members of the public to fully respond. So we wanted to utilise the panel to explore kind of two key areas of our plan really in a bit more detail. So we didn't ask them to look at the whole plan, albeit we did make it available to them, but we specifically wanted them to look at both the policy and place framework that sits within the plan, which ultimately starts to draw out, what are the policy priorities for different types of places in the North to help us deliver that collective vision. So we wanted to sense check that with people. And then the other kind of activity we ran through the panel was to explore the public's appetite, both to the strategic ambitions. So did they have a priority in terms of those strategic ambitions? What were their views around those? But also those right share targets, those mode shift targets, because as we know, it's all great for us as transport planners to sit here and say, to achieve decarbonisation, we need people to get out of their private vehicles and to use public transport or cycle or walk places more. But if the public don't have any appetite to do that, then we're all going to fail. So we needed to kind of sense check that with the public as well to see what their views were on the targets we'd set there. So I won't go into this in too much detail because they're in the deck. Within the final report, we'll have a lot more detail that sits behind all of this actually, which we can break down demographically, as talked about before, by gender, by geography, etc. But just to give you a sense, so on the policy and place framework survey, we kind of undertook that through July into August. And we got 101 responses from our panel to this. So we asked all of our panel who wanted to be involved in this activity, and a number kind of responded, and ultimately, I think it's fair to say when we look at the demographics of our panel and how we engage, ethnic minorities are underrepresented, and this is a common theme with all our panel activities. So I think ethnic minorities make up about 7.5% of the North's population, and that's also kind of demographically represented on our panel. But again, getting them to engage, getting people in those groups to engage with our activities is proving more difficult and something we're trying to kind of boost numbers on. But what is really encouraging in the panel activities is we've got a lot more kind of women kind of engaging, which again typically doesn't happen in transport consultations, etc. So women make up over half of our respondents actually, and again a good representation of those with disabilities as well. Again, a good 3 kind of key regions: the Northwest, the Northeast, and Yorkshire and Humber. And so generally, the panel, you know, while it's not statistically robust, it's really helpful for us just to get a sense of kind of people's views. Sorry, I'm just going to close my window because it's very noisy. Sorry about that. So just generally a bit of a headlines from the feedback on the policy in place. So there was a lot of support actually for the policy in place framework we've developed with our partners. And 71% kind of agree with the policies identified for their place type. So we asked them to look at their specific place type, which we use matching with their postcode. And as I say, in general, they felt the policies and the mix of policies we were putting forward felt right. But of course, there were a number of areas where they felt we could further improve that out. There were some areas where, you know, some policies perhaps had been overlooked or were missing, and they'd like us to do some further work on that as we revise the plan. But generally the sense was, you know, actually, you know, public transport absolutely is really critical. Improvement to bus services is going to be fundamental for a number of our place types. As well as making sure that the operating hours of our public transport and the frequency of public transport is increased. There was a recognition, as we've said, about the environmental benefits of local clean air, etc., and reducing car use in favour of public transport alternatives. Broad support for that where it exists. But again, a recognition that, for example, that actually, you know, that is going to be challenging, and we need to really understand, and there needs to be some further work, you know, nationally and with our local partners around promotion of the benefits of getting out of your car and using alternative modes, really. So some promotional activities that probably would need to happen to help support that mode shift in reality and in practice. In terms of the challenges, absolutely cost was front and centre for many people, and that was a key message when they thought about EV charging infrastructure, for example. So it's about, you know, how do we make sure that there's a just transition as we move forward and encourage mode shift? And again, it plays back to many of the points that we've heard today from Scrutiny Committee about, you know, EV charging isn't the panacea, you know, just getting people out of diesel vehicles and replacing, you know, changing the kind of the way that those vehicles are fueled isn't the full solution. And also we need to recognise, you know, at the moment the cost of EV vehicles is prohibitive to a number of people. So again, you know, we need to kind of recognise those points and work with partners and national government to think about solutions to address those. Again, in terms of mode shift away from cars, you know, that recognition of changing behaviour, but also it's that carrot and stick. So it's about how do we make it a viable option for the public to kind of have confidence in making that transition. And again, just some of the more general feedback in terms of what was missing from the policies. So a lot of the feedback is around, you know, actually it's how this will be delivered. And I think that's a fair criticism, but also we need to recognise, you know, what TfN's role is. You know, ultimately, the policies that sit within the policy in place framework primarily will be decisions to be made through your own local transport plans at a local level around what the right mix is for your given place type. And the funding for that often will also sit at that local level. So, you know, in TfN's view, it's not for us to say how these will be delivered, but it's for us to kind of identify the evidence and the solutions and then work with our partners to explore, as you say, funding that would support the delivery of this on the ground. But then again, you know, some feedback that some didn't identify with their place type, and that's fine. So an example of that around visitor destinations, which is one of our 9 place types. So again, you know, the thought that within those place types, a lot of the policies were aimed at visitors themselves rather than residents. And so certainly some further work for us to do there as we revise the document. Moving on to the strategic ambitions and right share, again, I touched on this before, but thinking about the strategic ambitions, again, generally lots of support for what we've put forward, and mixed views around their importance. So really interestingly, actually, with the public, their importance was around social inclusion, which, you know, perhaps isn't surprising, but really closely followed by economic growth, actually, above decarbonisation as their kind of top priority, and recognising the opportunities that economic growth brings in terms of jobs, etc., and quality of life, etc. So some interesting insight there, but generally the feedback was, you know, while there was a mixture of views, as I said earlier, it's that kind of that all three strategic ambitions are actually key and central to what we want to achieve for the North, and are intrinsically linked. On this kind of activity, I think we've got 119 completed surveys, so, you know, and again, quite representative. And again, the demographic data was very similar to the last one. So, you know, ethnic minorities were underrepresented, women were well represented, as were disabled people. But again, young people were perhaps underrepresented within this cohort. The key kind of findings for this, I've touched on the strategic ambitions there, sorry, but the right share stuff. So again, you know, broad support actually for the right share targets that we'd set within our plan. So both the medium term, the 2030 targets, and where we need to be in terms of active travel, and car and public transport use by then, as well as the long term kind of targets as well. And where there was thoughts around, you know, perhaps people disagreeing, we've got more kind of data to explore. Well, which aspects of it were they unsure about? And again, ultimately, it's about, as we've touched on, some of those alternative options. So, you know, where perhaps there's been disagreement around whether or not we'll be able to achieve some of those targets, that's because they feel the current provision of public transport, for example, is too poor and doesn't. And perhaps in some of the place types, again, perhaps isn't representative. So thinking about, you know, perhaps the targets need to be re-looked at to think about urban and rural split, because again, you know, having kind of a headline target, while it's helpful for us to kind of communicate, we need to recognise that certain places will go further faster, given their current level of provision, whereas other places will kind of perhaps get to that transition at a slightly slower pace, because again, you know, at the moment the alternative kind of provision isn't really there. So I was going to pause there. I'm happy to pause there and take any immediate comments from scrutiny, and then we'll talk about implementation. But I think I just wanted to kind of briefly touch on that, because I think it is helpful, given the discussion today, just to kind of be mindful of what the public's views are on some of this, actually, because again, as we know, you know, sometimes that the public view can perhaps be quite different to us as transport planners, and so sense checking kind of where we are with key aspects of the plan and what their views are, I think has been really important for us, and will be a key part and strength of how we revise the document.
Thank you, Lucy. I think that's fairly comprehensive and straightforward. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'd like you just to move straight on to the next bit, if you would, please.
Thanks.
Absolutely, and it's over to Katie, so I'll drive the slides, Katie.
All right, if you can pop the first one up, Lucy, after that would be great. Super. So, committee members, as I mentioned earlier, this STP is different. It is about outcomes for people and places. So it's about setting that ambition and that vision. But it's also why, when we put together the STP in draft, that we said we recognise we'd need to offer some advice separately to the TfN board on how we make it real and how we implement it. And we've touched on a little bit of that this morning. And it's something that came out through the consultation, which is, okay, lots of ambition. We've touched a little bit some of the practicalities, even in the conversations we've had here. How do we make it real? When we put the STP together, we had 3 areas that we believed where they would need action and implementation. And I've got those set out here on this slide. The first one was very much where TFN could add value and where TFN could support. And we set out what were called required actions in the back of that STP. And those are there in the document. I'm not going to run through them now, but what I can assure you is that we want to work and refine those with partners over the autumn. And indeed, we've touched on some of the subjects where we're already doing that. For example, the work that Darren's leading on buses and some of the conversations we're having around freight and logistics. And also some of the wider work that we've started, for example, thinking about hydrogen refueling and thinking more generally about that. I think some of the HGV charging infrastructure that one of the other councillors mentioned earlier in the meeting too. The second element is that while we have within the document captured some of those key pan-regional transformational schemes, such as Northern Powerhouse Rail, HS2, Trans-Pennine Route Upgrade, and one or two others in there as well, which are seen integral to the North's transport system. But recognising, of course, that actually the setting of those local priorities is very much for local transport authorities. But we have recognised that there is value in TFN being really clear about what are the short to medium term priorities ahead of next spring's budget. I'll come on to that in a moment, just to give you a little bit more detail about how we want to do that. And then finally, the very last line in the STP section around implementation is that, and forgive me, I can't recall which councillor mentioned it earlier, but when we think about the last 20 years, the last 30 years, how have we changed? How have we moved on? The work that we've done around economic growth through the Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review has said that the productivity gap that we identified in 2016 remains. That economic opportunity, therefore, still remains. So what do we need to do? How do we need to work differently to try and make sure the system of transport planning and delivery is actually helping us achieve the ambitions in the strategic transport plan? So it was why we said we need to recognise that to deliver the different outcomes that this plan is setting out, we need the mechanism, funding and powers to do things differently. So the third element of our implementation is about understanding what we might need to do to reform that system. And within the STP, we gave some initial thinking about what that might be. For example, around how the emphasis placed on benefit cost ratios in scheme appraisal, but also how we can think about the opportunities that more local devolution might bring, and the opportunities to work perhaps within funding envelopes to help partners prioritise. We had some initial conversations with the TFN Partnership Board on that yesterday, and we'll be having more conversations with them, with partners, over the course of the autumn, with a view that we bring some advice to the board alongside the STP for adoption in December. So if I could just have the next slide, please, Lucy, just to give a little bit more detail on that point too. I think we recognise there is a spring budget emerging. We recognise that there'll probably be a general election and comprehensive spending review. And we recognise that the public sector fiscal environment is very challenging. So actually, we've got to make the case to protect not just the investments and the finance that we've already got from national programmes, but also making the case where there might be additional investments we need. So we want to work more closely with partners over the autumn to just try and make sure that we've identified those critical pan-regional schemes and interventions, and bring that back, as I said, to the board, ideally in December. If I just go then to the final slide to let you know what that timetable looks like. We're here with you today. We were with the partnership board yesterday. That was very much focused on that early thinking around implementation, but we gave them a very brief headline of some of the numbers. And we're with exec board, with your directors of transport and such like, on Thursday. During September, our analysis of all the responses is ongoing. We've done some early work that we've been able to share with you today, but I think you're aware the consultation closed just a matter of a couple of weeks ago. So we're 647 to get through. There's a lot of work to do, and we'll be preparing advice for the board, taking account of your feedback this morning, to take to them on the 27th of September, where we intend to seek their steers on any amendments, and also views around some of the ambition that we spoke about this morning. We expect to then in early November do as we did at the very draft stage of the STP and complete an exercise with the DFT, our sponsorship team, to take them through it ahead of that board meeting, given that ultimately this STP will be provided as statutory advice to the Secretary of State. And then I think, Chair, as you'd already mentioned, we'll be back to see you, we hope, with a revised STP in November, and also the Executive Board before we go back to the main TFN Board on the 14th of December. And then, all being well, we hope to be publishing and launching it early in the new year, subject to the Board's approval. And I think that concludes our presentation for today. So I think it would just be great if there's any final comments or questions, Chair.
Okay. Councillor Hornby, please.
I just wanted to thank all the team for the work on this report. It's a really, really significant piece of work, and it must have been no mean feat putting it together. So, yeah, thanks on behalf of myself and all my constituents and everyone at Trafford Council.
That's really kind, Councillor. It's been a lot of work. Lucy has spearheaded much of this. I'm very grateful to all colleagues across TFN. And I think we're hoping that with all the wonderful constructive feedback we've had, yes, there is a lot to get through, that we can hopefully provide an STP to the board later this year that they'll be happy to adopt. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you very much. I don't think there's any other comments that I can see coming up. So I'd just like to say thank you from ourselves, the committee here. We think there's obviously it's obvious there's a great deal of work and some very strong learning that's gone on here. So we thank you very much for your work. I would like to encourage councillors to share the slide deck with other councillor colleagues, because I think it's worthwhile. I certainly will be, where we've got our local transport plan coming up in the next 18 months. And so suffice it to say thank you very, very much indeed for all the work. And we look forward to the next meeting, which is on the 21st of November. It will also be online. One of the things for the new members is, in theory, we planned that the winter meetings, because there's potential, we can have up to 6 meetings a year, but we have 4 that we must have, and 2 of which are generally face-to-face, and 2 which are online. The idea being that we timetable the online ones to be in the winter when perhaps travel is not so easy. We've got a little bit out of flunter this last year due to some last minute changes. So the next one is online on the 21st, and it looks like Katie and Lucy will be back again. So unless there are any other questions, I'd like to close the meeting, please.
Just a quickie, just to say that I've just checked my diary, and that is Cumberland Council's full meeting that day, so I possibly won't be able to get there, and probably Roger as well. I'm just looking at my diary and just double checking that anyway, so thank you.
Well, you'll always get the papers, and you can always drop us a line and say, would you ask this question on my behalf? So we're always happy to do that, and I know Katie and Lucy are always happy to receive fan mail. Thank you very much. In which case, I shall close the meeting.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.